It's great to be able to talk to everyone this evening. I guess in the US here, I'm in Singapore. It's roughly 8 a.m. And so I'm, and I found the topic of the whole program, how ways of knowing develop, intersect, and evolve, was for me quite interesting because the kind of embodied knowledge was something I wrote about a bit in The Souls of China when I talked about the physical cultivation movements there, such as in Taoist internal alchemy, and participated and tried to learn that, and the idea that you have to really do something in order to know it and to learn it. And then my current project, in some ways, I guess these things are all related, but it's also about transmission of knowledge in the sense that this is about Chinese people who are writing a new history or new histories of their country, and challenging, and in doing so, challenging the party's hegemony over the historical narrative in China. And so this is something I was working on simultaneously to the religion project, following people. And there are a lot of similarities in that religious communities, one of the first things they do in China is also try to recreate their historical, their history, because many of them don't know who their predecessors were. There was a break in the transmission of knowledge that took place during the tumultuous 20th century. Of course, everyone knows about the Cultural Revolution, but it goes on, goes further than that. And so I think that this search is something we find in many countries around the world. In China, it has particular resonance. And so I'd like to talk a little bit about that. Let me share a PDF, or not PDF, sorry, a PowerPoint. And so this is the title, Writing a New History of China. And move this ahead a little bit. Yeah, one of the people who I'm writing about in this project is Tan He Chung. This is the person in the picture here. Is a journalist in Hunan who had documented a massacre during the Cultural Revolution. Tan had spent many decades compiling case studies, oral histories of thousands of people and their who had been murdered in this particular county, Dao County in southern Hunan. And I spent a bit of time with him as he tried to piece this together and continue his work. He's published it in Hong Kong, and it's called Blood Fables in Chinese. And then part of it, or a version of it, was translated and published by Far Strauss Giroux a couple of years ago as The Killing Wind. And the story for people who know China is relatively familiar, that after the Communist Party took power, they declared people who came from, quote unquote, bad backgrounds, landlords, people who had worked in some way for the KMT, the Nationalist Party, to be black elements. And many of them, even in the sort of early years, the early 50s, were given then inferior jobs, or if they were farmers, they were given bad plots of land to farm, and so on and so forth. But then as the campaigns really began in earnest in the late 1950s with the anti-rightist campaign, and then of course in the Cultural Revolution, these people suffered terrible persecution. And in Dao County, the Mao had declared that these black elements were possibly going to cause a counter-revolution, and the local officials, there were rumors flying that they had weapons, and all this was completely fanciful, but all these people were, who were really at this point the poorest of the people in the county, were rounded up and frog marched all night long to a small ridge with a limestone pit, and the adults were clubbed in the head with a hoe and kicked into the pit, and the children were thrown in also. And then over time, they died in this limestone pit, except for one woman. And so this tombstone was erected by Mr. Tan on the site of the massacre. Underneath it is the limestone pit. And the one woman who survived was this named Zhou Chun. And she then was rescued by other villagers a few days later, and later remarried. And then he interviewed her and many, many other survivors from the different or witnesses, eyewitnesses to these events. This, wasn't. I think these things were portrayed by the party, especially in the early 1980s, as isolated events. And under the reformist party secretary Hu Yaobang, there was an investigation, and that's how Mr. Tan got involved initially. He was sent down by a magazine from the provincial capital, Changsha, to go and write a report. And it was meant to be, as problems often are described in China, as a one-off, as sort of bad apples, things that had gotten out of control, but was not part of a systematic policy. And then Tan realized, as he interviewed more and more people, that this was a systematic policy, that all the people in the county had been killed, and that it wasn't just limited to this county, but happened in many different parts of China as well. And so he made it his lifelong calling to investigate this. And he, for me, is one of the interesting people in China who do this. He's not a classic dissident. I mean, he's not, obviously he's still living in China. He's not living in exile. And he also kept his job at the magazine. The magazine never published his article, but he continued to write for it. And on the side, in his spare time, he went back down time and time again to Dao County to do more and more interviews. But he was slowly marginalized. He was never promoted. He was never made an editor at the magazine. He was never allowed to do things which people often get to do as they get on in their career, like judge writing competitions or be sent abroad. And so he was sort of shunted off to the side. And this is typical for a lot of the people who engage in writing these counter histories of China, at least the people that interest me the most, that they still have one foot in the system, but they're not, but they still are trying to push the envelope a little bit and try to find ways to make this story told. And they continue to do this even today, even now, with the harsh crackdown on dissent in China. So I think this is sort of a broader movement by Chinese people. Initially, some of this got official support. As I mentioned, in the 1980s, party secretary like Hu Yaobang encouraged this. But even up until recently, there were efforts by people like the former secretary, Mao Zedong's former personal secretary, or one of his many personal secretaries, this man here, Li Rui, who supported, he was sort of a patron saint of these independent historians. Li Rui was persecuted in the from the late 1950s through the end of the Cultural Revolution, and later came back, was rehabilitated in the late 1970s, worked for a couple of years, and he just passed away a couple of years ago at about 100 or 101 years of age. I have to check exactly, but he was most important probably as somebody who helped run a history magazine in China called Yanhuang Chunqiu, or China, I think the official name of it is China Through the Ages. And this was a magazine that was just closed down a year or two ago, right around the time, maybe not coincidentally, that Li Rui died. But this magazine allowed historical research to be done. Again, it was often quite careful. You couldn't directly criticize the party too strongly, but the reports still got out. And so there was still a way for this information to be spread around China. Yeah, I mean, I began working on this and met many of these people in the mid 2000s, and that was, in hindsight, a relatively open period in China. Probably the most open period in the history of the PRC was the 1980s, leading up to Tiananmen, when sort of anything or everything was on the table. And there was even an effort to separate the party and the government, with the idea that the party might even change, but the government, you'd still have an independent civil service. Many people, there are many discussions about other things, other forms of government, etc. I think the party was even on some level thinking there may have to be elections. All of this ended, of course, with Tiananmen in 1989. But then with China's economic takeoff, there was a bit more space for independent action. And then the internet made a huge difference in China. I mean, I think there was a bit of a ridiculous feeling in Western countries, especially in the United States. The internet would be some sort of magic bullet that would democratize countries around the world. And of course, China, the government, the Communist Party, was very adept at figuring out that it needed the internet, but it figured out ways to control it and co-opt it. But in the early years, in the 2000s, in the late 90s, 2000s, up until, I don't know, arbitrarily, we could say around the Olympics or something like that, 2009, there was a sort of golden age of journalism that flourished online, bloggers, citizens, there were independent film festivals, digital technologies like cheap handheld cameras, video cameras allowed people to go out and interview people. And conveniently, people often say it ended with Xi Jinping taking power in 2012, but I think it began a little bit earlier than that, the turn against this. But what I found is that there's still this desire and effort to recreate some or rebuild some sort of knowledge base about the past that is independent of the party's version of history. And obviously, this doesn't apply to most people in China. As in any society, most people are not interested in these kinds of issues. But there is, to me, surprisingly widespread, informal network of people who are very interested in these topics. And I find that they, I mean, it's really hard to go to any town or city in China. And once you know the people and they introduce you, you find that they're kind of everywhere in many universities and in many think tanks, newspapers, etc. They don't always have venues, the ways to get their information out, but there is this widespread interest. And in terms of lineages, I was thinking of how information is spread and how history is created. One of the groups that interested me the most was the publishers of a magazine called Spark, and that's people who are familiar with the history of the PRC may have heard of it, but it's not that widely known outside, especially not even really in China. This is a story that should have really disappeared because it was so small, and it survived thanks partly to luck and the internet and this inspiration to people today. This magazine, Spark, was created by a handful of young people who were caught up in the anti-rightist campaign in 1957-8 and sent off to labor camps. And when they saw the famine that was engulfing China in the late 1950s, they created this magazine they found a mimeograph machine in a local tool shed and ran off some copies of this magazine. And it has very clear cited analyses of how the famine spread, how local officials were trying to please higher ups, higher's up, and there were no checks and balances, and the party had this lack of accountability, and so Spark. Then this is the one you see here is the first issue, 1960, in June. The second issue was, this was distributed, just sort of handed out and mailed to a few people. Hardly, you could say it almost had no distribution. And the second one had absolutely no distribution at all because the police came and seized it before they could send it out. And it could have just died, as many, I'm sure there are, of course, many publications and efforts like this that just try to come up and are extinguished. But Spark survived in part because when the rehabilitations took place in the late 1970s, some of the people who survived, many of the people who published this, who I showed in the previous picture, were sent off to labor camps. Some died there, but some of the people survived, and then they went to a judge and they asked, who was rehabilitating these cases, and asked if their police files could be released. And he handed over hundreds and hundreds of pages, maybe thousands of pages of documents relating to their case, including copies of the mimeographed magazine. And so this is why there's even an image of this today. And then in the 1980s, this sort of circulated just among a few people who might have known it, people who had been in the labor camps, etc. People started to type out the magazine. As you can see here, it was originally handwritten, but they typed it out. And then with the rise of computers, PDFs, and the internet, it began to spread. And people began to learn about this. And one of the very famous film studies scholar, Cui Wei-ping in Beijing, she now lives in California, she said after she read about Spark, she said, now we know who our ancestors were. Now we know what our lineage is. We know that there were people trying to do exactly the same thing 50 years ago. We just didn't know about it. And so this has a very powerful feeling. You begin to realize we aren't alone, and there were people trying to do this before, and that this problem that we've identified in our time was something that other people had identified earlier, so the state's unchecked power. And so it had this really powerful effect. One of the people who was inspired by this was an independent filmmaker, Hu Jie, who made a series of really powerful documentary films in China. This is just a screen grab of one of his films called Spark, where he recounts the story. And this really then helped spread it for people who didn't really know anything about Spark. The film, it did not obviously have widespread distribution. It wasn't in cineplexes in Beijing, Shanghai, and Guangzhou, but it still spreads. And I'm not trying to give some sort of mystical feel-good story that the government can't control the internet and these things spread anyways. The government has done a pretty good job at controlling the internet. Most people don't know about these things, but people do spread this. One of the things Hu Jie does, unlike many filmmakers, is he doesn't care if people pirate it. And when he's released films, he always insists that it's released on YouTube. Now, as probably most of you know, of course, YouTube is blocked in China, but many people in China, there are pretty reliable estimates of the numbers of people in China who use VPNs, virtual private networks, and there are tens of millions of people. Of course, there are hundreds of millions of people who use the internet. So the number of people who use VPNs, it's small in relative terms, but in absolute terms, you're still talking about tens of millions of people who have VPNs. And again, most of them are not looking up Spark and these kind of films. Most of them are probably trying to get to dodgy sites here and there, or just some sort of gaming things, or goodness knows what, or they don't even use it that much. But there is reliable data on the number of VPN users. And so people can get VPNs, they can access this kind of stuff if they're really interested in it. Another thing are simply thumb drives. USB sticks. I mean, I've had so many films given to me as just, here, take this stick. These memory sticks are so cheap. If you meet people, you can go, here's my latest film. You just hand it out like candy at Halloween or something like that, and people get it. And then they cut a copy and send it off to somebody else. And so it does spread. And so Hujia's films are widely known in Chinese intellectual circles. Not enough to change if you believe in ideas like collective memory or popular consciousness. If you accept this, probably not enough at this point to change how people think about their history. I would say definitely not enough right now, but enough that it affects a certain class in the intelligentsia who matter because they are the people who are writing histories. And I've made a project over the past 10 years to try to interview people like this, have a dedicated page on the New York Review of Books website. It's called Talking About China, where I talk to public intellectuals, sociologists, journalists, filmmakers, some of the people you may or may not know from here, such as the journalist Zhang Xue in the upper left, Guo Yuhua, second from left on the upper level, Chen Hongguo, my own thing here is blocking who's on the right-hand side, Hu Faiyun, a novelist, lower left-hand, Tiger Temple, who's a very early videographer who made a series of about 100 videos as he rode his bicycle along the Yellow River and used to post them all the time. Ai Xiaoming, the literary scholar, and that's Hu Jia, second from the right in the lower level there. And so these are people who have who make this kind of work. They're all inside China. Well, Hu Faiyun, the novelist, is actually living in Vienna now, but and many of them are still trying to find ways to publish their work. Guo Yuhua has had about 50 different WeChat accounts over the years, and she keeps changing all the time. And she publishes, the journalist Zhang Xue, she writes articles. Many of them get blocked, but then many times people do screen grabs of the articles before they get blocked, and they send them around as JPEG files, which is a way to get around the censorship, because a JPEG, it's hard for the character reading software that the government uses to block stuff. It's hard for them to block JPEGs because they're images, image files. So, and I'm sure that there will be, and there probably already is software that can read this stuff. So it's a bit of a cat and mouse game. And I think overall the government is winning it. But it's, to me, the interesting thing is that people keep doing this, and they keep having some measure, depending on your expectations, and mine are usually quite low, but they do have some measure of success. So just, yeah, and this is Chen Hongguo, the guy I just showed him one of the pictures previously. They had a public space in Xi'an that was just closed down about a month or two ago, called I Know Nothing, and they would give talks on different topics, not political things, but this was a lecture he gave on King Lear, where he drew the not too subtle comparison between King Lear and the leadership of the Communist Party, which was not listening to the good daughter, but listening to the bad daughter that was always telling it what it wanted to hear and stuff like that. And maybe that's why he got closed down. But it was also partly to do with coronavirus. But he continues to give lectures online, has not been blocked from doing that. He gives video lectures, and then people pay him by clicking at the bottom, and China, just like in a lot of countries, you can pay money to people who write articles directly at the bottom of the article, which is not a bad idea, I guess. It's kind of like Substack, maybe in the US, right, where you can get if you have enough followers, you can actually generate a pretty decent income. This was their gift shop. This is taken from this Socratic aphorism, I know nothing. And in Chinese it's called 知无知. And these were the speakers that they'd had at their public space. And this is really also like a who's who of these public intellectuals in China, quite male dominated, as you can see. And people would come and just read books. It was kind of like a library, but a reading room, really, where people would go and read, and there'd be lectures. It wasn't a bookstore, sometimes described as a bookstore, but it wasn't really like that. All they really sold was coffee and book bags. But I think that, there are spaces like this that exist. The government is really pushing against this and closing these things. But you can see the hunger, the appetite for this among people. And even if the public spaces get closed, I think it's hard to completely eradicate it. I want to just, sort of give a completely different example of this among working class people. When I was living in China, I was expelled from China last year as part of these tit for tat diplomatic, not diplomatic, but journalistic expulsions that took place under the Trump administration. And but up until my departure, I joined these performative pilgrimage associations. These are groups that perform at temple fairs in China, and they do sort of, in this case, stilt walking, and they tell stories from classic novels like The Water Margin, or The Water Margin is a key one. And these groups are working class based groups that still get a lot of young people who join them. And one of the things, they have these sort of training areas, clubhouses, and on the walls are the red banners or awards they've won from the government. So they're not in contradiction with the government. The government thinks this is just folk culture, and the government supports traditional culture nowadays. So on the one hand, the government sees them just as a kind of harmless folk culture, stick fighting, stilt walking, the kind of thing that seems quite harmless. And they also, though, have religious elements that aren't exactly in keeping with government priorities, and they have their own histories. And so on the left-hand wall, you can see there's a big calligraphy with about 6 characters, and below that is a small piece, is another big piece of calligraphy with many hundreds of characters on it. And that is a short history of the group that they wrote because they had lost so many members. This group goes back to the Qing dynasty, but there was this break in the 50s, 60s, and 70s. And then when it came back in the 80s, it tended to be old people teaching very young people. And so they didn't have a great sense of their history. So they went out and they dug up photos and from their initial recreation of the association back in the 1980s. And they did an oral history project of their own on how the group was, they didn't make a big deal of it. This wasn't sort of a center point, like say it would be for some of the public intellectuals, but how they were persecuted in the cultural, starting in the late 50s, really, with the Great Leap Forward, all the way, sort of 20-year period from the late 50s to the late 70s, and how they were persecuted in the Cultural Revolution, what happened to different members. And they, published a little booklet of this, self-published thing. So it's not, but people then become aware of their history like that, I think. Yeah, that group that I mentioned was founded in 1748. In fact, so it has a pretty long history. And so I think, we could ask the question of why history matters to these people or to the party. And, of course, history matters to every culture and every people. That's one simple answer, of course. And, if you look at, say, the debates in the United States over monuments that are even older, say, than some of these battles. These are over the Civil War. There's still debates over what monuments should stand in public squares and what monuments shouldn't. And these are events in the United States that are over 150 years old. So you think that, oh well, why are Chinese people interested in this ancient history of 50 years ago? Or 60 years ago. It's not that old comparatively speaking, and it's still within living memory for many people. So we can see that there's this universality of the of people's search for history and what is the appropriate way of telling history. And I think one could posit that in communist countries, history has a especially strong resonance. This is a picture of a civil society organization in the Soviet Union, late Soviet Union, early post-Soviet era called Memorial. It still exists today, and they were trying to literally dig up the mass graves of the Stalin era and recreate the history of that time. And I think in communist societies, you do have this idea that history is what has this almost magical, mystical force. That history is moving in eras that lead inevitably, inexorably toward communism. And so that history has some kind of a mythic power. And I think that this is something that is quite powerful in China as well. Marxism in China is layered over older ideas of history, that history in traditional China is like a judge and juror. It decides whether a dynasty has ruled correctly or not. And historical writing in China has often been very moralistic. This emperor was corrupt or not good or didn't pay attention to the affairs of state and therefore was overthrown. And so that the good ruler is supported by history, and so it's a bit of a tautology. If you're ruling, then you must be doing something right. History has conferred upon you the right to rule. So there's two solutions that ruling people can do. They can say, well, I'm going to try to rule properly and justly and so on and so forth. But if there are any dissenting views, I don't want this to get out because this will undermine my claim to rule. So just as in imperial times, the desire to suppress counter histories or bad news is quite strong in China. And this is something that Xi himself has spoken about extensively. He talks a lot about the importance of history. He likes to cite a Qing Dynasty poet, Gong Zizhen, who says, if you want to eliminate a people, first go after their history. And he, of course, one of his signature calls early on in 2013 was that you can't negate the first 30 years of party history, that you can't, in other words, be in favor of the reform era. He was thinking of Communist Party history being 60 years at that time. It's longer now, obviously, and being roughly divided into two 30-year periods. The first 30-year period from 49 to roughly 79, the Mao era, we could say. And then after that, the 30 years of reform, which you could think of as the Deng Xiaoping era, Deng and his successors, his handpicked successors, including Hu Jintao. And now we're, of course, in the third era, the Xi era. But Xi's point then, at the beginning of his era, is that you can't use the reform era to negate the Mao era. So it's two sides of the coin. And so therefore, criticism of Mao and that era is not allowed either. And so I think that despite this, people still continue to look to dig into this. I just met somebody last year before leaving China who's writing a history of the anti-rightist campaign at Peking University. And I asked her, for example, why are you doing that? And she said, well, I'm a graduate from Peking University, and it's supposed to be one of the great universities in the world. And yet the entire, almost all the professors and many of the best students in the late 50s and 60s were completely eliminated from the university. And nobody knows this history in China. So she's gone around collecting newspapers, doing some oral history, but mainly collecting information and digging stuff out of this person's oral history and that person's oral history, some published materials. A lot of oral histories have been published, especially in Hong Kong. So she's collected all this and is writing a history of the anti-racist campaign at Peking University. I say she purchases material online. It's amazing how much you can get at this website in China called Confucius, the Kongzi Wang, which is a used book site, but you can also get documents. You used to be able to get a lot of documents that used at the antique markets in Beijing. That's all. I don't know if it's been sort of closed down, but I think also there was this huge disgorgement of papers and material in the 90s and 2000s. People bought a lot of that stuff, but it's not really. You don't find so much of it anymore at the markets, but you can still buy some stuff online, used bookstores, overseas publications, and oral history. And this was a workshop that I participated in, just to give you sort of the broad appeal, where people from around China came to Beijing to learn the techniques of oral history and how to, just basic technical things like how to set up a camera properly, how to put a microphone on somebody. And then they went back to their hometowns and worked on it. This is not the, some people may be familiar with the project by Wu and Guang, who had this workshop that he set up in Beijing and sent students back to their hometowns, and they did oral histories. And these films, many of them are fascinating works, are now housed at Duke University in their digital database, and I think you can access it through the Duke libraries. But this is more of a bottoms-up effort. These are people who just were genuinely interested, and there's a oral history center at the China Media University in Beijing. And so these people just came and participated. They were not professionals. They were people who were just interested in the topic. As you can see, many of them, these are on the backs of their head, many of them are young people. I would say most of them were in their 20s and 30s, a few people in their 40s, but they were just interested in this topic. And we're not, some were journalists, and I've kept in touch with many of them over the years, and they have interviewed grandparents and tried to find out about their past. So I feel like there is a broad, widespread interest in this, maybe because the official history is so uninteresting that it doesn't satisfy people's desire to know what really happened in the past. So if I just return to end here, maybe I returned to Mr. Tan, and I, asked him what happened when the article, he went back home and his article wasn't published. And as I said before, he remained the editor at the literary magazine, but was kept on the margins. He published his book and in Hong Kong, and there's now an English translation. And so he told me how he felt and this sense of moral outrage, and that something sort of had to happen. And he's quite a colorful character. And so he said to me, I'll just quote, he said, I can kiss ass as well as anyone. I'm really good at it. In fact, I'm an excellent ass kisser. I can tell people what they want to hear, and I can write an article in the way you want it. But I have a minimum moral standard. I can't turn black into white. Somehow, I just can't do that. So when they said they wouldn't publish it, I thought, okay, that's your problem. But my life had changed. And so I thought, this is it. One way or another, I will publish this. And so we did. And so maybe I'll just end there with my contact information in case we don't have a chance to exchange views during the